Welcome back to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, and today's episode sits a little closer to home than most of them do. This show is called Strides to Solutions, and there's a horse standing quietly inside that name, and it isn't decoration. A stride is what a horse does, and it's forward motion, but it's rhythmic and honest, and it happens one measured step at a time, which is more or less how I've come to believe change actually works. So today I want to look directly at the thing behind the name. What is it that horses actually do for people? Equine therapy has become popular enough by now to attract both true believers and eye rollers, and I don't think either camp is being careful enough with the evidence. The believers say the horse feels your soul, the skeptics say it's an expensive pony ride with a therapist attached, and the research says something more interesting and more useful than either of them, which is that horses appear to genuinely help, that we can see it in the outcomes, and that almost everything we assume about why is either unproven or, in a couple of striking cases, actively contradicted. That gap is where this episode lives. It's the space between it works and we know why it works, and I find that space fascinating rather than embarrassing. Science spends most of its life there, and pretending otherwise is how good ideas turn into bad ones. So here's our stride today. First, what the outcome evidence actually shows, because if the effects weren't real, none of the mechanism talk would matter. Then the three mechanisms researchers propose laid out fairly, then the studies that complicate the beautiful story, and I'm going to give those to you straight rather than tuck them in a footnote. Then what does seem to be doing the work, which turns out to be quieter and more precise than the mythology. And finally, why the horse alone was never the answer. Let's take the first step. Start with outcomes, because everything else depends on them. If people are not actually getting better, then arguing about mechanism is arguing about the anatomy of a unicorn. So the first question has to be whether anything is happening at all. It appears that something is, with caveats I'll name honestly. In a randomized trial of military veterans with PTSD, therapeutic horseback riding reduced PTSD symptoms, with significant change showing up by 3 weeks and larger change by 6. An open trial of a structured 8-session equine assisted therapy program found marked reductions in both clinician rated and self reported PTSD and depression, and those reductions were still holding at 3-month follow up. There's supporting evidence beyond the trauma work as well, a meta-analysis of equine services for veterans with PTSD support symptom reduction, though it also flags that most of the underlying studies carry a high risk of bias, and I want to name that as a real limitation rather than bury it. In a randomized trial with patients being treated for substance use disorders, equine assisted therapy improved emotion regulation, self efficacy, and self esteem. And there's one study I'll come back to more than once. Researchers interviewed Israeli military and police veterans with PTSD about their experience of equine assisted therapy. And three things came out of it consistently: self regulation, bonding, and hope. So something is happening here. The honest summary is that the outcome evidence is promising and uneven, which is not nothing and is also not proof. It sits in the middle, which is where most real things live before we make our minds up about them. Now let's look at the mechanisms, because researchers have proposed a coherent and rather beautiful story about why this works. I want to lay it out properly and fairly before I start poking holes in it, because it deserves a real hearing. And parts of it may well turn out to be true. The first proposed mechanism is attachment. The idea is that a horse can serve as what attachment researchers call a safe haven and a secure base, meaning somewhere you can retreat to when you're distressed and somewhere you can venture out from when you're ready. One group of therapists described equine psychotherapy as an attachment laboratory, which is a phrase I find genuinely lovely, a place to practice relating with lower stakes than a human relationship, alongside a body that cannot lie to you. The second mechanism is co-regulation, and this is the one that excites people most. The claim is that the horse's calm, large, steady nervous system helps to settle yours, not through words, but through proximity and rhythm and breath and touch. And there is supporting evidence, including a study that found heart rate synchronization between children and horses during equine assisted therapy, with the children who had ADHD showing that synchronization by around the fourth to sixth session. The third mechanism is embodied learning. The horse gives you immediate, honest, nonverbal feedback about your own body, about your tension and your posture and your intention, and it responds to what you are actually doing rather than to what you say about yourself. For people whose trauma has made talking about feelings unbearable, that route into emotional work, in through the body rather than the mouth, may be the only route currently open to them. So that's the story, and it's a good one. Bonding, co regulation, and embodied honesty braided together into a coherent account of how a large animal helps a wounded person. I believe parts of it, and it's plausible, and it's supported by a great deal of qualitative work in which people describe exactly that experience. Now, let me complicate it because the research contains findings that the mythology would rather you didn't hear. I'd rather you trust me than be charmed by me. And this is the section where those two things come apart. So I'm going to give you four results in a row, and they build. Here's the first. In that randomized PTSD writing trial I mentioned, the one where the PTSD symptoms genuinely dropped, the emotion regulation measure did not reach statistical significance. The symptoms improved and the proposed mechanism did not, which is the kind of result that should make anyone slow down. Here's the second, and this is the one that made me sit up. Researchers ran an experiment in which they deliberately manipulated the horse's stress level and then measured the humans interacting with it. If the co regulation story were simple, a stressed horse should stress you and a relaxed horse should calm you, because that is the entire model. There was no significant difference. Clients interacting with a stressed horse versus a relaxed horse showed no meaningful difference in their own stress, mood, or anxiety, which means that whatever is happening in that arena, it is not simple emotional contagion, and you are not a sponge quietly absorbing the horse's serenity. Here's the third, and it costs us something to hear. Another study examined how therapy horses responded to mentally traumatized humans and found that the horses responded more to human physical cues than to human emotional states. Sit with that one, because it dismantles something a lot of us want very much to believe. The horse may not be sensing your soul, and it may simply be reading your shoulders. And here's the fourth. In veterans, the horse's cortisol, oxytocin, and heart rate variability often showed no clear change, even while the human's PTSD symptoms were improving. So the biological signature of the relationship is not tracking the healing in any straightforward way, which is a problem for a theory that says the healing is the relationship's biology. Let me widen it one more step, because the broader animal attachment literature is sobering too. Systematic reviews of attachment to pets and mental health find mixed and sometimes null results, rather than a clean story of bond leading to well being. And in some cross sectional work, people with poorer mental health report stronger bonds with their animals, which raises an uncomfortable question about which direction the causation runs. Maybe the bond doesn't always produce the well being. Maybe sometimes the distress produces the bond. So, where does all of that leave us? It leaves us somewhere honest, and I'd argue somewhere more interesting than where we started. The horse is helping, and the reason is not the reason we assumed. So let's go looking for what is actually doing the work, because there is a pattern in the data. It's quieter than the mythology and considerably more precise, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. The thread running through the strongest findings is not mystical connection, it's felt safety. Look at what happens when researchers get granular about it. A study measuring heart rate during equine assisted therapy found client horse heart rate correlation appearing only with a familiar preferred horse, not with any horse in the barn. Not a horse, that horse, the one the person already knew and already liked. The grooming research points the same way, and it's oddly moving. Gentle grooming on the body areas the horse actually prefers increased the horse's contact seeking and reduced its avoidance. Standard, routine grooming, done the way we usually do it because it's efficient, often produced more negative than positive emotion in the animal, which means even the touch has to be the right touch, offered on the horse's terms rather than ours. And the human physiology tracks the same principle. During low demand contact, like grooming and petting, human heart rate drops. During anticipation and during challenging tasks, stress markers rise instead, and higher pre ride cortisol predicted more negative emotion and behavior during difficult riding. So, safety is not automatic. Putting a person next to a horse does not reliably produce calm, and anyone who has been near a nervous animal on a bad day already knows that in their body. It produces calm when the interaction is familiar, gentle, low demand, and genuinely mutual, which reframes the entire thing, and I think this is the heart of the episode. The horse is not a healing device that you point at a wounded person. The horse is a condition. It creates a situation in which felt safety becomes possible, and it is the safety that does the work, and the safety has to be built rather than assumed. And notice how completely this fits everything we have been doing on this show. Remember the loneliness episode where the brain does not count your friends but appraises whether it is safe. Remember the avoidance episode where a fear model only updates when you stay in contact with the feared thing long enough for the predicted harm to fail to arrive. Remember the meaning episode, where an appraisal of safety runs downhill into your autonomic system and your hormones and your immune cells. Now put a horse in the middle of that framework. If the encounter is set up well, a horse is a large, warm, nonverbal, entirely non judging animal that keeps failing to hurt you over and over while your body is standing right there paying close attention. That is not mysticism, and it doesn't need to be. That is precisely the kind of repeated, embodied, prediction violating evidence that this whole series has been teaching us is what actually changes a nervous system. And there's one more piece I have to hand you because the romantic version leaves it out entirely. It isn't the horse alone. The best supported model in this literature is not the horse at all, but the triad horse, client, and therapist working together as a system. The evidence for that is subtle and rather beautiful. One study of physiological synchrony in horse assisted therapy found that stronger therapist horse synchrony was associated with stronger horse participant and therapist participant synchrony. In other words, the therapist and the horse being attuned to each other appeared to organize the whole session, which means the therapist was never background. The therapist was part of the instrument. And here is my favorite honest detail in this entire body of research. In a study of patients in substance use treatment, participants spoke powerfully and at length about their relationship with the horse. But they did not describe the horse as improving their rapport with the therapist, even though the therapists themselves believed that it did. I love that finding because it is the sound of a field catching itself in a flattering assumption, and it takes real integrity to publish something like that. So, what's the fair conclusion? The horse appears to be the entry point, providing safety and engagement, especially for people who cannot bear to sit in a quiet room and talk about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And the therapist is what turns that opening into something durable by structuring it, interpreting it, and helping the person carry it back into a human life. The horse gets you through the door, and the people help you build the room. Let me pull the whole stride together now. Horses do appear to genuinely help people heal, especially people carrying trauma, and the evidence for reduced symptoms is real even if it's imperfect. But the mechanism is not what the poster says because the horse is probably not reading your soul, and a stressed horse doesn't make you stressed, and a calm horse doesn't simply pour its calm into you. What seems to be happening is quieter and, to me, considerably more moving. In a well built encounter with a familiar animal, in a gentle and low demand interaction with a skilled human standing alongside, a person's body gets to have an experience it may not have had in a very long time. Nothing bad is happening right now, and I am not alone, and I am not being judged. And that experience repeated is evidence. It goes into the same predictive machinery we have been studying all series, and it updates the model and it rebuilds a little of the felt safety that trauma took away. Out of felt safety comes regulation, and out of regulation comes the capacity to do the harder work that was impossible before. That's what the horse is for. Not magic and not a miracle and not a soul reading oracle with hooves. Conditions. Here's what I hope you carry out of this one, and in the end, it isn't really about horses at all. Whatever your version of the horse turns out to be, and it might be a dog, or a garden, or a workshop, or cold water, or one friend who has never once flinched at you, the mechanism is probably the same. It isn't the thing itself that heals you, it's that the thing creates a reliable, repeatable situation in which your nervous system finally gets to gather evidence that it is safe and capable and not alone. You don't need the mysticism. The ordinary version is remarkable enough on its own, and it has the considerable advantage of being true. And that, finally, is why this show is called what it's called. Not because horses are magical, but because a stride is honest and rhythmic and forward, and it happens one measured step at a time, whether or not you feel ready for the next one. That's the stride from suffering towards something you can actually use. Thanks for walking it with me. I'm Esther Adams. This has been Strides to Solutions, and I'll see you next time.